Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to our challenge with the Docusign for the Goodall Hackathon regarding the participatory mapping for collaborative conservation planning with decision maker sign-off. Few words about myself. My name is Lilian Pintea, and I've been working with the Jane Goodall Institute for almost 20 years. I'm the Vice President of Conservation Science at the Jane Goodall Institute here in USA, in our Washington, D.C. office. I'm a conservation biologist, and I have more than 25 years experience working with applying geospatial technologies for conservation. I've been working in sub-Saharan Africa since '97, and I had the privilege of working with Dr. Jane Goodall and our incredible colleagues and our partners, local communities and governments in Tanzania, Uganda, DRC, Congo, and many other countries in Africa. So, yesterday was the day when, in 1960, Dr. Jane Goodall arrived at Gombe. She was equipped with an old binocular and a pen and a notebook, and she was looking to these hills and learning about chimpanzees and figuring out how she could be accepted by chimpanzees to observe their behavior. Now, Gombe truly opened new ways for us to study and understand not only chimpanzees, but many other animals. And by focusing on individuals, by focusing on their behaviors and connecting to these animals, Dr. Jane Goodall was able to observe some really incredible behaviors. First of all, in the same year, a few months later, she discovered for the first time that the tool use, and that triggered this comment from famous anthropologist Louis Leakey that now we must redefine the tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans. So many studies have been coming from Gombe National Park since then, and that research continues. We still have Gombe Stream Research Center every day. Our staff in Gombe following chimpanzees from morning until evening and collecting all sorts of behavioral data, helping us to understand not only chimpanzees, but also ourselves and our evolution of our social and ecological systems. I encourage you, if you want to learn more about Gombe research, to follow this story map, which we developed. Here is a link. But today, the Jane Goodall Institute, it's so much bigger. It still has a focus on understanding chimpanzees and our place in nature, but it includes now other great apes, and it also includes our own engagement, our youth in helping people to become a better stewards for not only chimpanzees, but other animals and for our shared environment. So I wanted to say a few words about chimpanzees. They are our closest living relatives, right? They live in communities, between 20 to 150 individuals. And in this community, they live in parties or subgroups. So there is very complex social organization between these subgroups in this community, and a lot of they're very aware what's happening in their communities. Chimpanzees have very strong mother-infant bonds, and often you're watching chimpanzees and you almost cannot help yourself. Again, comparing and seeing how we interact with our own infants. They rely on ripe fruits. They eat sometimes animals as well and other insects, but they rely on ripe fruits and other plants, which are mostly common found in forests and woodlands. And they really depend on the forest and trees as well for their nesting. Every day they build a new nest like you can see here an example on the right where they sleep overnight. The chimpanzee range used to cover the entire Central Sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see here on a former range with probably more than 2 million chimpanzees ranging in this large space. And unfortunately, today, this is the current distribution of the chimpanzee range in Africa from the IUCN. I can mention more about this later because it's part of your challenge. So why? What's happening? What are the major threats to chimpanzees? Well, the major one, as I just showed you, is habitat loss and degradation. And this is happening because of a variety of reasons. You know, we're talking about conversion of forest and woodland habitats to farming, to industrial agriculture, logging, mining, conversion to settlements is a major one. Another big threat is illegal bushmeat trade and poaching. Disease, again, incredibly important, both diseases like Ebola and other diseases, respiratory diseases transmitted from people, maybe to chimpanzees. Illegal pet trade is another concern and threat. So if we're looking at the Jane Goodall Institute science goal is to inform, influence, and inspire all stakeholders, everyone, to protect chimpanzees and create a better world for people, other animals, and our shared environment. This is, at the core, is recognizing that the health of animals, people, environment is interconnected. And this observation, which and this holistic approach that Dr. Jane Goodall started from her research in Gombe, it's something which we continue to support by providing solutions which help us to look at these three interconnected systems. Now you can see here that an important cross-cutting theme in supporting the entire institute is our use of technology, right? And how science is supporting not only studying chimpanzees, but also working with communities, working with youth and our roots and shoots. Of course, continuing the research at Gombe, but also dealing with status of animals in the wild or in captive conditions. So the potential role of data technologies is enormous. And obviously, looking at the last, you probably heard already that 90% of today's data was created in the last 2 years, right? But this has been true for over the last 30 years. And every 2 years, we generate 10 times as much data. The question which we're asking at the Jane Goodall Institute is, well, how this amazing data and technologies end up in informing real conservation decisions and ultimately leading to wiser decisions and a better and removing or minimizing some of these most important threats. So that question creates a foundation to how we actually apply and work with partners like yourself in connecting these incredible technologies with actual realities on the ground. And we're starting from the basis that recognizing that actually around 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in the hands of local communities. It's in the hands of these communities, private owners, districts, territory governments who have the power and the responsibility and managing these resources on a daily basis. We recognize that our role as a conservation organization is to empower them and facilitate that they are doing better decisions on behalf of their own landscapes. And we call this approach Takare. Now, the Takare is about, Takare has a couple of stages, and one of the stages is developing a common understanding. And that common understanding is not just about science or data. It's about integrating all sorts of knowledge, from traditional knowledge, from expert opinion, from data, of course, and scientific results. But we're about integrating all different types of knowledge. In order to do that, we use the power of geography. to integrate all sorts of information and connect this information in specific landscapes. So for example, you see here examples of how we use high resolution satellite imagery to capture some local knowledge. We're using it with communities to do participatory mapping of the medicinal plants, land use, their knowledge of pretty much how this landscape structure and function. And we're also using a more structured, more science-based approach, which is called Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation. And that approach is all about guiding through another participatory process where you're asking the questions about what you're trying to conserve. What are the most important factors defining the health, what you care about to conserve? What are the most important threats, and not just what's important, but what are the priority threats? And then together with multiple stakeholders, we work to develop this, to build on this common understanding and objectives and goals, to then discuss what we can do about what are the major strategies, what are the actions, and who is doing what, and how we're going to measure success, that what we're actually doing makes a difference. So as part of this process, we often engage, as I mentioned, conservation mapping and conservation technologies. And this is an example of a conservation action plan which was developed for Eastern DRC. It's a huge area. We're talking about 230-something thousand square kilometers. It's the size of half of California. And in this landscape, we're talking about potentially living more than 35,000 chimpanzees. It's one of the largest population, but it's also an area which has lots of challenges. And when we are developing with other stakeholders such conservation action plans, we end up using maps at that common language where it helps us connect and discuss different variables and different data. So here is in the middle is an example of one of the maps from this conservation action plan. And you can see at the bottom how many organizations are involved. And each organization contributes a set of stakeholders as well, and experts. So our geographic information system analysts and mappers have to continuously integrate this data, but to not only produce this map, but also create a process in which different stakeholders of different technical backgrounds could contribute and validate and improve these maps. So right now, this process is done not very efficiently because it's done mostly by emails, and it includes with the development of ArcGIS Online and better tools such as dashboards and web maps and incredible opportunities to connect real data and maps with dynamic web-based maps. It opens opportunities for us to have these maps live and updated in real time. It also creates an opportunity for us to share these maps with decision makers and share not only a picture, which they cannot control or interact with, but a more dynamic web map, which if they wish, they could explore and change the scale and have a better understanding of different layers of information. What is missing is a process which allows that interaction to be recorded and documented in a way that it could inform the final decision making, and it also could inform the but it also could be stored for future records as part of the metadata for that map, and also for those data sets. There is not a single conservation action plan that didn't result in new data and improved data, because when we work in many places where we work in Africa, the geospatial data infrastructure is still in development. There are very little type of data sets which are totally perfect. And one of the first things which we do when we start such a collaborative process, we share with the broader stakeholders, decision makers in the room, what are the latest data which we have, and we ask their validation and inputs in improving these data sets. So each conservation action plan which we are generating is creating this type of collaborative processes, and it creates actually a space where decision makers can sit down with scientists, with conservation practitioners, and have a dialogue. So our use of science and technology is not about applying this for the decision makers, but it's with decision makers, and not providing an answer, but providing inputs and facilitating a dialogue where people can then have an agreement how to work together in addressing this very complex, difficult threats to what we care about, either it's chimpanzees or ecosystems or other species. So the challenge is, it's quite straightforward. Help us leverage the technologies on the Esri mapping side with the Docusign technologies to make this process more integrated, more dynamic, and help. And at the end of the day, helping the Jane Goodall Institute improve the speed and the use of and support of this collaborative process involving maps with multiple decision makers. Now, I want to thank you again for your interest in this challenge, and of course, whatever solutions will come out will have implications not only for chimpanzees, but for any conservation action planning or collaborative process involving using geography and maps and mapping technology. So I'm very excited about in seeing your ideas and how we can make decision-making, conservation decision-making, more participatory, more collaborative, and that people can own the decisions on their own landscapes. Now, I want to thank you also our partners, mostly on the geospatial technology side and the government side. And maybe I will bring to the screen right now my the page describing the challenge. So I can go a little bit in more detail over the requirements. Right, so as I mentioned, this app, this workflow solution which you will be developing should include Esri ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Pro, or a combination of ArcGIS technologies and ArcGIS platform. It include. We would like to share with you an example, for example, an example of a chimpanzee range, which you can download it either yourself from the ICN species, red-list species, where you can also follow a link where we put this data set on a Dropbox. It doesn't really matter. I think this is more for you to be able to have actually geospatial data set, in this case, chimpanzee, the latest knowledge of where the chimpanzee range is in Africa, how they are distributed. And often those chimpanzee ranges, they are not a done or fixed thing. I mean, first of all, of course, unfortunately, we constantly are dealing with increasing threats, right? So this means that some of the small polygons or some of the areas where chimpanzees used to be, they might not be there anymore. So it requires expert opinion who know what's happening on the ground to be able to make these changes. But often it also happens that we don't have the complete knowledge in some maybe more remote areas where the chimpanzees maybe still exist. So engaging in adjusting and improving those polygons is really important. So maybe what you want to do is to create web map involving those chimpanzee polygons. I suggest you to focus on East Africa, just because it includes an interesting area with, we have a conservation action plan also covering that area. And one of the first things which we are doing, as I mentioned, is asking the question if these chimpanzee polygons are still correct. And usually what happens, the decision makers have either locations or they have alternative suggestions how these polygons should be drawn. In some cases, they have coordinates which they would like to share. In many cases, they might even would like to share with us the GPS locations or new polygons which they developed themselves. So help us trigger a Docusign signature process in which this map version is shared with this, let's say, a community of decision makers. Doesn't matter how many, but usually it includes any number from 2. I think we had, in some cases, we had as many as even maybe 20 or 30 decision makers which had inputs in the same time to the same map. So imagine that there is a new location or a new polygon. So enable these decision makers to actually draw or add that point or capture those GPS coordinates in the feedback, and ideally help us make those changes back, somehow integrated into the GIS workflow that allows the GIS user to then improve those data sets and create the next version of the map based on those inputs. It's important to us that that there is a process which can be iterative as many times as needed, because most of the time we don't get it right from the first time. So please help us to build into this dialogue with different decision makers and their inputs. Help us to have a way to track and record those inputs, because often different experts might have different data sets, and this would allow us to then have a record which will accompany that map and that GIS data as well. What else?
Dr. Pintea, if I can direct your attention over to the chat, I think we have a couple of questions for you here.
Fantastic.
So let's start up at the top, if you can see it from John. So he says, Dr. Pintea, assuming there is overlap between geographic locales for different stakeholders, how do you reconcile conflicting reporting and validation? Are you able to see that question?
I'm just looking at it right now. Yes, I do see it.
Okay, I'll let you answer that one, and there's a couple more below.
Great. So again, it's a great question, and as I said, part of the process of this is that it encourages a transparent dialogue and discussion. In some cases, people might have hard evidence, they have data, they have GPS locations, they have pictures, they have camera traps, data, survey data. So in this case, of course, we add the data which we didn't know about it, and we provide the next version of the map. In some cases, it has to deal more with a consensus and a discussion about maybe two experts which they think that the range should go in a different way, and then that discussion is facilitated by a conservation action plan facilitator, which they are trained to be able to make sure that there is a dialogue and a consensus is reached. So the answer is we are integrating this data, this new knowledge which is coming in. We're overlapping. If there is an overlap and a conflict, we show that, and we continuously then improve the map until we reached a point where everyone is happy to move on to the next stage. Next. Should I go ahead and just start reading some of the questions?
That would be great. I'll put them up here on the screen so everyone can see which question we're on.
Sure. Okay, can you please, so it says, could you please talk a little bit about the different roles of stakeholders and whether they will be validating data individually and as part of the group? Great question too. So this is a process. When we're developing a conservation action plan, we are stressing that this is not just a document which you publish it and you put it in a library and you're done. No, the goal is to have an ongoing process, and even after the plan is developed, you still have implementation, you still have indicators to measure and monitor, you still have follow-up to then discuss and see how you're doing with the indicators, and discuss if your level of knowledge needs to be adjusted or changed, or new data integrated, and your assumptions also need to be changed, or if your strategies are not working and need to be adjusted, scaled up, more resources put in, or completely new strategies and actions added. So, so this means that stakeholders are working in multiple environments. Sometimes, when we are lucky, we get together, and that face-to-face time is really important. So we work together, but most of the time we work individually, separately, and we are coordinating and collaborating remotely. So another question which I see is that some of the participants submitted the request to IUCN, and they didn't receive yet access to the data. Usually, those requests are dealt quite almost in near real time. But I can also understand that if there is an increase maybe in requests, it might take a little bit longer. So we will provide an alternative link to this data set, which is open for you to access it and use, along with some of the metadata and information how you should reference and cite this data set. Who approves the changes requested by the stakeholders? So the changes requested by the stakeholders are approved by the conservation planning team. So it's approved by the stakeholders themselves. We have a facilitator, one or no, most of the time we have two, and sometimes even more facilitators, since it's a very collaborative process. And the goal is that the group, this group of stakeholders reaches an agreement. In many cases, this is very difficult, but the process is designed to, and the people are trained to facilitate that and help us achieve that those agreements. How often a new version has to be published? Oh, sorry, and just I wanted to say that while this is a collaborative decision, the person who is making the changes and often have to make those judgments, of course, is the GIS mapping person. However, that person just facilitates sharing of this data, and then the role of that person, of course, is to listen and get this inputs from the stakeholders to improve the map and provide the next version. So another question is, how often a new version has to be published? Again, it depends. I can tell you, the experience is that of course, you try to create versions not too often, because that will make it will be quite complex if you have to adjust some of these layers all the time. However, it happens in in short periods when, let's say, we are working on the conservation action plans, and that those changes might happen on a daily basis. So in some cases, a GIS person facilitating and working on developing, let's say, a geographic scope or conservation target map, which includes a species distribution range, they might have inputs on a daily basis, and they might need to develop those maps and share it with stakeholders every day for a period maybe of 1 to 2 months. So it depends on the problem and the question, but it has to allow the GIS person to share the data easily on a daily basis, I would say. Yes, so we will add the data link in this. I think my colleagues from Docusign will help with that. So another question is, usually when conservation areas are being mapped as protected areas, usually we capture all kind of data points. I can think of geocodes, population data, maybe deforestation levels. Oh, absolutely. I hope from my presentation you got an idea of how complex and different data needs which we have in conservation are. Because on one hand, of course, the question is, what is the best knowledge of what you try to protect? So in this case, we are trying to protect chimpanzees and the habitats, but habitats is also means forest, right? So you need to understand where the chimpanzees are, how they're doing there, and also what's happening to the habitat, what type of species, what type of forest and habitat types you have there. But this is just the beginning. The most important part is understanding the threats. And as I showed to you, those 4 general threats have actually many reasons why a habitat can be lost. So it could be expansion of farmland. It could be expansion of logging concessions. It could be illegal poaching activities. All that data can be captured by different GIS layers. So for example, expansion of farmland, you can maybe capture it through mapping from satellite imagery of deforestation or changes in land cover and land use. But you can also have inputs from community forest monitors, for example, of a location using mobile devices and apps showing a location where they found a village forest reserve being converted to farmland. So you have multiple points and data points coming from the field, coming from other GIS analysis, coming from remote sensing, aerial and other type of sensors, which we're integrating in order to then inform these conservation decisions. The chimpanzee range is just a simple way, we try to provide you a layer which we know that we are working constantly to review it and improve it. But of course, if you feel the need to add additional layers, such as deforestation layers, please go ahead. This solution should be working with any type of mapping data, not just with polygons, such as chimpanzee ranges, which we share. Could you please describe in more detail the types of stakeholders in the local communities, example, government official, right? Again, it's a very good question, because depending on the scale at which on which you are developing a conservation action plan, where you're designing a plan, the stakeholders change. For example, when we developed the layer, we contributed to the IUCN layer for the chimpanzee range-wide distribution, which you are working in with this assignment. And that included stakeholders as part of the section on great apes under IUCN. And those are the chimpanzee experts who collectively provided that input, right? That was a very, a more global overview, because we look not only at chimpanzees, but all the great apes and other primates. However, as you start going to the regional, national scale, those stakeholders are changing. You still have representatives from the chimpanzee scientists, researchers, but their knowledge and focus changes. So you do have some sort of scientists present, which they study chimpanzees or habitat. You do have usually conservation practitioners who are trying to address this problem. Of course, that includes the Jane Goodall Institute staff on the ground. It also includes our partners and other conservation NGOs, local NGOs, international NGOs. Our work is embedded in specific country policies and governments, and often our role is to facilitate implementation of government policies and connect those policies with their own local communities and stakeholders on the ground and local institutions. So we're very active in engaging and working with village governments, with districts, with regional governments, and of course national governments. Then there is a set of stakeholders such as academic partners in the country. Every country has its own scientists and researchers which are active. There are government agencies responsible, such as responsible for managing wildlife. There are government agencies responsible and having the mandate to implement and protect the protected areas, such as national parks, for example. So, sorry to go so much in detail, but it is a very diverse, complex set of stakeholders which we're working on a daily basis and consulting with and facilitating, depending on the scale of that conservation plan. All right, so we'll get to you. Okay, so John. Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, so naturally you're already familiar with ArcGIS. What is GGI's present degree of familiarity with Docusign? What other tools do you rely on heavily? Microsoft Office 365, etc. Fantastic, very good question, because conservation NGOs are trying to solve huge problems with our partners, but at the same time we have very modest capacity and resources, and we always have to align what I want to achieve versus some of the realities, and the choice of how we're investing in technology is really important. Yes, we already have been using our GIS technology pretty much since 2000. So we have a long history institutionally in using our GIS. The reason the entire science platform, the geospatial part of it, is built on our GIS platform, because we realize, while we of course work with open source data, open source solutions, we realize that on the long term, it's cheaper for us to, instead of building or maintaining solutions, instead of building on solutions which already have been made, and then just customizing or adapting it to specific needs which we have on the ground. So this is our theme. So Esri ArcGIS technology is one of them. The another part of the data sets which we're working is Azure, Microsoft Azure environment. All our non-spatial data right now, videos, images, scanned documents, in terms of data, acoustic data, we're storing in our Microsoft Azure accounts. And obviously there are APIs and bridges between the spatial part of the platform, between Esri and Microsoft Azure. The Docusign, GGI is using Docusign technology quite extensively, and right now pretty much is aligned with helping us to streamline internal approval process for contracts and budgets and so on. So we're looking forward to see where this major three components, Esri, maybe Microsoft Azure, and the Docusign technologies could help us a little bit be more integrated and work together more efficiently. Thank you, John. Any other questions? Let me just look, see if I missed some. So just to be clear, the map itself, like what you visualize there, is not as important. It's not about what type of layers you put in the map. Yes, you can use the IUCN ranges, just to learn maybe also about chimpanzee distribution and make it a little bit more relevant to our work. But the really important part is that integration between the Docusign approval process with a dynamic mapping interface, which allows to update the map live and if it's possible to trigger and store this feedback and inputs and approvals live. And I would just say something that of course we're looking the more integrated solutions that enable both the GIS user and stakeholders to interact and achieve this goal, the better. And we are really, in my opinion, I'm looking to a variety of ideas and solutions and recommendations which we're coming up with. Can you give an example? How do you validate data? Do you just use the credentials of data uploader as proof enough, or we have multiple humans verifying the data? Well, yes, I can imagine a near future probably where you can base some of validation using crowdsourcing. It's incredible how crowdsourcing works, and not just citizen science, but especially when you start bringing the intelligence of the crowds to help us through these decisions. We are not there yet, so and also the really important part here is not improving and validating the data. It's engaging in the ownership of the people who make decisions, and then they are responsible and have a mandate to implement those decisions. It's about them embracing that science and data and knowledge and changing their behavior to do to change to result in conservation on the ground. So it's about that. It's about engagement, ownership, and participation of that data. So I still need to see how maybe crowdsourcing would. I can see scientists, of course, who would really welcome crowdsourcing and solutions, but I also can see the power of the dialogue and trust and building that trust in that process. And then I do see that science data actually being then used more than if you just publish it in a peer review paper or try to get the best data possible. So engagement, ownership, really important. What are the typical tech limitations on the ground? Do we need to keep some of them in mind while creating our solutions? Again, a great question, because you saw a couple of maps where we're in the villages, for example. We don't have computers. We don't have sometimes power. We don't have devices. It takes a lot to bring, let's say, a mobile device to a local community and support citizen science. Not just because that communities in some of those areas might not have as much free time, but they don't necessarily have access to the internet or to these mobile devices. So usually the Jane Goodall Institute, when we are validating, applying a technology, we are looking at all barriers for a successful technology use, right? I call it the last mile in conservation because that's the most expensive part. Um, and this solution, which we are asking you, assumes that stakeholders do have a computer, do have access to the internet, and they're able to interact collectively in a remote fashion. And um, and that pretty much covers most of the stakeholders except local communities at this point. So these conservation action plans, again, depending on the scale, because of course, if you do a conservation action plan at the community level, this solution might not work. But most of the conservation action plans which we do includes government stakeholders, and they do have access to the internet. Or the Jane Goodall Institute is working actively to help and support districts and so on to have access to the internet in order to be able to access these resources. Yes, so I'm just looking at the questions. Yeah, so I'm glad that this was useful. Thank you again for your interest in this challenge, and we will be ready to answer any other questions and be in touch. Good luck and have fun.